Hey everyone, in today's rather mediocre car review, I'm going to be talking about this Toyota RAV4 from the 2017-2018 vintage. So it's a little bit old, but they're reasonably cheap, so I figure it's worth discussing whether they're worth considering. Alright, so in terms of the RAV4, my basic overview is it's adequate for the price, but it isn't exactly astounding and it's very sluggish. Now in the United States, the models appear to be a little bit better than in Australia, where I'm based. However, you're still going to get reasonably tepid acceleration, tepid performance, and it's not going to be exciting, but it will do the job for inner city driving if you need to transport stuff around and need a reasonably small SUV. So that's my overall thoughts on it. However, if you have any views on the RAV4, drop those in the comments below, and otherwise it would be brilliant if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Okay, so let's start off with performance, which is perhaps the least interesting part of a car like this. Basically, it's reasonably slow. And by reasonably slow, I mean we're looking at about 143 horsepower for a car that's reasonably large, which means that the acceleration is quite tepid. So it's quite slow, particularly going up hills, particularly if you're carrying a large load. You're not going to be going anywhere particularly fast. Now there are some models that have about 176 horsepower. That's not the one that I'm driving. And that would be a little bit better, but still not perfect. Now the acceleration on that model is apparently around 8.3 to 8.4 seconds to get from 0 to 100 km per hour. So we're talking about something that is a little bit faster than the current model. That implies that the model with 143 horsepower is going to be rather slower. However, exact figures are a little bit difficult to come by. Just bear in mind, it's going to be reasonably sluggish. So that's the acceleration component of it. In terms of the general maneuverability and practicality of it, the handling is perfectly fine for a car of this nature. Nothing sporty, nothing negative, it's just adequate. In terms of the other visibility related factors, it has good visibility out and around the car, from out the back, toward the sides, from the side mirrors, from the reverse mirror. So it has reasonable visibility, so it's quite practical. It's also not large, so you can get it in and around the city reasonably well. Now the main downside when it comes to maneuverability is going to be the reverse camera. The reverse camera is small and not high resolution. It exists, which is obviously a must if you're driving it around the city, but it isn't particularly good. It also isn't great when it comes to sensors around the car because you won't really be able to detect what is in around you. So again, maneuverability and practicality is fine, but it's certainly not best in the class. And the more recent RAV4 is doing a much better job of this than the current RAV4. Similarly, the more recent RAV4 is significantly better acceleration-wise than the car that I'm driving at the moment. So that's the performance side of the equation. Not brilliant, but it's going to be adequate enough. We can next look at things like comfort. Now, comfort and interior quality is again okay, but you get what you pay for. A lot of the materials are kind of cheap, and a lot of the materials try to look like leather, but patently are not. So for example, there's faux leather on the dashboard, which tries to have this stitching in it, but it doesn't really work because it's plastic. Similarly, the steering wheel has like a leather look to it, but again, it's patently obvious that it's just plastic. Maybe plastic with a little bit of give, but certainly just plastic. The seats are cloth. You could obviously upgrade some of these things, but then you're spending more money and it's probably not really worth it. So basically the material quality is not high, but it's going to be durable and it won't break. So you have swings and roundabouts there, pluses and negatives in terms of comfort and interior niceness. Put differently, it's fine, but it's not going to be a nice place to spend a lot of time, is effectively the summary there. Now, if we're looking more deeply at some of the aspects of the practicality here in terms of the interior, and I'll get to boot space in a second, if we're looking at a bit more in terms of practicality, there's more than enough space in the front. The back is a little bit on the small side, but it's not dire in that you'll still fit in the back. It still won't be too painful. You're not going to hate driving long distances like a lot of small cars, but it's not going to be massive. So if you're really tall and you're trying to fit really tall people in the back, it's not going to be the most fun experience, but there's more than enough headroom. There's decent enough legroom. It's adequate in that respect. In terms of other storage and the like around the car, there's enough cup holders, the doors have some storage in them, there's obviously a glove box, that's unsurprising. There's a little bit of an alcove in the dashboard, which is probably not really very useful, but it exists in case you want to use it. Basically, it's got what you would expect for something to be adequate, but it's not great, is basically a summary, and you're probably detecting a theme here. So what about technology? Well, this is actually another negative point for the RAV4. It has some rudimentary technology features that you would want, but they're not brilliant. So for example, it has an infotainment screen, which is not surprising, but it isn't great. It's small, not super responsive, and it doesn't have many features. It has some technology, such as lane keep assist, but again, it doesn't function wonderfully well. It doesn't really have collision detection, and it's missing some other features. So doing a deep dive into this, the infotainment screen is, like I said, small, and also not many features in it. So it does have rudimentary navigation, which is, I guess, nice, but oftentimes, given the nature of the navigation system, you'd rather use your phone. It doesn't have Android Auto, and it doesn't have Apple CarPlay, so you can't connect your phone to the infotainment screen, so you're not going to be able to use your phone in that manner. It does have Bluetooth connectivity, but again, that's primarily just for audio, really. Now, that's effectively the infotainment screen. It has a reverse camera, but the reverse camera is not high resolution, and it's quite small. So again, it does the job, but it doesn't do the job well, and it is absolutely not a class leader. And given the price that some people are still trying to get for these in the used market, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In terms of other technology, it does have lane keep assist, which I generally keep off because it's annoying, because it doesn't function wonderfully well. It has other pieces of technology that are useful, so for example, electronically controlled mirrors, which is relatively standard for a car of this vintage. However, seats are still generally manually controlled. So again, you're going to miss out on electronically controlled seats if that's important to you. To me personally, that's not a big issue because in my Lamborghini, they're sports seats and they're manually controlled anyway, so not a big deal. But for some people, that will be a big deal. So overall technology is not great. It does have some USB ports, which I guess are nice to have, but again, minimal utility there really. So overall technology is not brilliant. If we're turning our mind to the gauge cluster, again, reasonably standard for a car this vintage. The gauge cluster is analog, which again is what you would expect. It has a small screen in the center, which gives you some idea about things that are going on, i.e. alerts you to what settings are on, etc., but again, not great. It's not the worst, it's adequate enough. So nothing particularly untoward. It has driving settings such as Sport and Eco, although I don't really know what Sport would really do in a car of this nature, and Eco is obviously going to further worsen the performance. So again, I would be cautious about actually using that, to be totally honest. It will create issues if you actually want to kind of go up hills. So that's pretty much a summary of the technology. Again, not class leading, not great, but it exists and it does the job, but doesn't do the job especially well compared to the peer cars, and I would be looking for other cars if I were really in this market. And in particular, you'd be looking at things like used Porsche Cayennes, which honestly, even though they're older for some of the ones in the same price point, do a bit of a better job, to be totally honest. Now, if we're looking at just practicality in terms of boot space and that type of thing, here it's again okay for a small SUV. You effectively get what you would expect for a car this size. So this is not going to be a full-sized SUV, and you would not go into this expecting a full-sized SUV. You'd go into this expecting a car that you could transport some suitcases around in, but certainly not a significant amount. And if you need to transport anything big, you're going to need to put down the back seats. So practicality is meh, is probably the best way of putting it in terms of the boot space. However, again, it's adequate for the price range, and I wouldn't be complaining too much. It is what it is effectively the summary there. So if we're basically summarizing what I think of this car, it's an adequate car with okay performance, but the performance is quite slow, and that's the major letdown because the acceleration is tepid, particularly up hills. It takes a while for the acceleration to kick in. It's not a fun car to drive. Handling is fine enough. There's nothing majorly negative to say about that. Technology is another negative point here, where the technology is lagging behind. The technology was not great for the time, screen is not good, it's quite small, reverse camera is quite small, technology is not brilliant. So that again is another negative. Interior quality is another negative because the interior quality feels a little bit on the cheap side, i.e. the plastics feel a little bit cheap, nothing inside is particularly nice, none of the materials are nice to touch, the cloth is adequate cloth, it's basically stock standard Toyota interior with nothing particularly nice to write home about. However, when we're looking at value for money, these things probably won't really break, so they're probably going to be acceptable value, but I think there are better options for the price point. And you could probably consider other things for this same amount of money that are going to be nicer to live with and or larger and or are going to have better performance depending on what exactly you're looking for. So in short, there are better options in my opinion than this car. In any case, those are my views on the RAV4. If you have any thoughts about it, drop those in the comments below, and otherwise, it would be brilliant if you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any thoughts about how terrible this video is, obviously drop those in the comments below. I take those on board, although I guess there's a limit to how interesting I can make a RAV4 review. In any case, thanks so much for listening in, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.